In the years before the world caught fire, when wireless sets still glowed with warm valves and officers still trusted the steady hum of long-wave ether, a curious scene unfolded in a British laboratory. It was late in the 1930s, a time when the Empire's doctrine on signals was as stiff as the starch in a guardsman's collar: high frequency, amplitude-modulated voice for distance, shared standards across services, and caution, always caution when faced with novelty. Radios were lifelines, not toys. They carried orders, corrections, and sometimes the last words a commander would ever give. Better they be noisy but known than silent and strange. Then came the heresy. A young team of Royal Signals engineers had been experimenting with something peculiar, very high frequency, frequency-modulated voice. It was not that VHF was unknown. The Royal Air Force already whispered across short distances on those bands. But FM? That was a foreign idea. American, experimental, lacking the comforting crackle of the known world's airwaves. To many senior minds, a radio that did not hiss, did not murmur, did not sound alive, was not to be trusted. So, on a grey morning of rain-slick cobblestones and wool uniforms, a demonstration began. A prototype set sat on a bench, its cases crude, wires like ivy spilling from the side. One officer leaned in with the air of a man sniffing an unfamiliar ration tin. Another crossed his arms, boots polished to mirrors. "Right then," someone muttered. "Let us hear this wonder." The operator switched on AM first. The room filled with static, a constant seashell roar, the eternal chorus of the ionosphere. Even idle, the set sounded busy. A few clipped test messages drifted through, buried beneath hiss and atmospheric pops. Familiar, if not pleasant. The officers nodded a known quantity. Then the operator flicked the switch to FM. Silence. Not the silence of a dead set, not the choking quiet of a failed circuit, but the sort of silence that felt intentional, poised, waiting. It unsettled the room. One colonel frowned as though insulted by the absence of noise. Then the operator thumbed the press to talk key. A voice emerged, crisp, clean, and strangely modern. No static, no whisper of cosmic weather. A sentence spoken in the lab next door sounded like it came from inches away. Words in the open air of London were often less clear. The colonel blinked. Another officer adjusted his spectacles. A lieutenant grinned, perhaps thinking of platoons on the move, no longer fighting their own radios to be heard. Then the operator released the key. Perfect quiet again. "Heresy," someone muttered under his breath, half joking, half wary. Because this silence, this purity felt almost like sorcery, and soldiering has always feared sorcery. The demonstration continued. Transmissions cut clean through urban clutter. The equipment shrugged off electrical interference that would have scrambled AM. Nearby, spark gap noise was simply ignored. It was, in every technical sense, a success. Yet the atmosphere in the room did not warm. Something in the officer's eyes said too new, too strange, too risky. After the trial, a clerk filled in a form. "Promising," he wrote. "Advantageous clarity, yes, but unproven at scale. Unsure compatibility with existing Empire sets. Heavy power demand. Manufacturing lines already committed to known sets. And most damning of all, unknown performance in the Empire's jungles, deserts, and mountains." The verdict arrived with all the authority Whitehall could muster. Not adopted for general issue. Better the devil you know than the angel you do not recognize. The prototype returned to its shelf. The lab returned to business. The Empire would march to war with the familiar HF, AM, sparks of static dancing in every officer's headset. It was not negligence. It was conservatism, forged by centuries of campaigning. And war was imminent. There would be no grand leap of faith now. Across the Atlantic, a different mood prevailed. Where Britain had tradition, America had impatience. Where London weighed the burden of empire, Washington chased innovation with the zeal of a nation not yet scarred by Dunkirk or Singapore. And the Americans had a prophet of their own. Edwin Howard Armstrong, the stubborn genius who had invented frequency modulation and defended it as fiercely as any commander defends a bridge. The U.S. Signal Corps listened. They ran trials, not in quiet London basements, but in fields, motor parks, armoured schools, and airborne camps. They strapped prototypes to jeeps, bolted them into turret baskets, and sent paratroopers jogging under the weight of new packs. They cursed, soldered, rewired, trained, and cursed again. And then the sets began to sing, not loudly, not with the messy boastfulness of AM. They sang in clean syllables, in short clipped orders, in nets that remained silent until a voice pressed the key. By the time American forces prepared for invasion in the European theatre, two critical FM tools were ready. The SCR-508 and its vehicle-mounted family tank and armoured unit lifelines, rugged and sure, commanders speaking from steel to steel as though their hatches touched. The SCR-300 manpack, 40 pounds of coils, batteries, and destiny, riding on the shoulders of infantry platoons and airborne pathfinders. Heavy, yes. A burden, yes. But when a scattered company needed to gather, it spoke. When confusion reigned, it cut through. When silence meant death, it offered connection. And most of the time, when no one spoke, it made no sound at all. Silence as a weapon, silence as discipline, silence as an advantage. American officers did not laugh at quiet. They leaned into it. In training fields, men learned to trust a radio that did not hiss. They practiced brevity until it felt like instinct. They learned what it meant when two voices spoke at once, and the stronger captured the net. They discovered that in many fights, a clean 500 yards mattered more than a dirty 5 miles. And above all, they learned that a net which did not distract could command attention like a veteran sergeant, silent until called upon, then decisive. In hindsight, the British hesitation is easy to judge. But history is written forward, lived backward. The War Office faced constraints real and immediate, production lines, supply chains, doctrine carved by empire, and the urgency of looming conflict. A miracle on a lab bench is not the same as a reliable field set in Burma or the Western Desert. Yet history also loves its ironies. After victory, when calm returned and lessons hardened into doctrine, Britain embraced what it once touched and laid aside. The wireless set No. 31 descended from American FM design entered service. The silence once mistrusted became the new professional sound of command. And somewhere in that old lab memory, dust, settling on an abandoned prototype, the laughter faded. For in war, as in science, sometimes the future arrives quietly, waiting for the world to hear it. Below is the next chapter, continuation, to 700 words, matching tone, structure, and pacing. The irony, of course, was that to American ears the silence was not mystical at all, it was mechanical certainty. Edwin Armstrong had waged intellectual war long before tanks rolled across Europe, and he won that battle not with bullets but with coherence. Frequency modulation was not magic, it was mathematics. It was physics. It was the discipline of ignoring the noise of the world and listening only when signal truly spoke. Still, the United States Army Signal Corps had doubts. In 1939, early field trials of prototype FM sets produced scenes more comedic than revolutionary. Infantrymen cursed the weight. Tank crews banged fists against metal when early power supplies faltered. Engineers scribbled in notebooks, while sergeants muttered that no soldier in his right mind would carry a set as heavy as a BAR rifle and trust it to work in mud, sleet, or the burning dust of Arizona test ranges. And yet, through the static, one truth emerged. When the sets worked, they worked like nothing else. At Fort Monmouth, officers gathered in the pine-flecked training grounds and witnessed a platoon exercise. 2 squads, positioned on opposite slopes, vanished from one another's sight. In the AM sets the British still trusted. Static crackled and instruction dissolved into mush. Voices drowned beneath atmosphere and ignition noise from idling trucks. But the experimental FM sets cut through clean. commands whispered low travelled farther in comprehension than shouted orders in the old system. A lieutenant colonel watching folded his arms and uttered a phrase future historians would quote for decades. If you can speak, you can command. And if you can command, you can win. It was not poetry. It was logistics. It was control. It was the difference between a platoon reacting in seconds or floundering for minutes. And in war, a minute is often the difference between a medal and a field grave. Yet technology is not adopted by clarity alone. It must endure soldier cynicism, the most rigorous testing apparatus ever devised. Men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions strapped early SCR 300s to their backs and marched across southern training fields. They cursed every pound. They heated their hands on the warm chassis on winter mornings. They resented the bulk and the curious, clean quiet that followed them like a ghost. But they learned. They learned net discipline. They learned brevity. They learned that silence could be read, not feared. A silent net meant readiness receivers open, orders imminent. And when those first paratroopers stepped out over Sicily in 1943, and later when they prepared in English fields for a night that would echo forever in history, they carried more than radios. They carried a doctrine: speak only when needed and be heard when it matters. Across the Atlantic, British liaison officers embedded with American airborne units listened, observed, and sent reports back to London. What they witnessed unsettled habit. The Americans were not shackled by legacy networks spread across half the globe. They did not carry the weight of inter-service compatibility stretching from Cairo to Calcutta. They could gamble where the Empire dared not, and gamble they did. One brigadier, an artilleryman with dust still in the folds of his battle dress from North Africa, remarked after an exercise observing American airborne FM nets in Devon, "Their wireless is silent until it kills you." It was not entirely admiration. There was envy too, threaded with doubt. But he did not laugh. No one laughed now. In Whitehall, signals officers reviewed transcripts of combined training exercises and saw what mattered most. American FM did not merely transmit orders, it prevented confusion. It cut through artillery noise. It ignored lightning storms. It did not care for the cries and ghosts that haunted the AM spectrum. Yet the machine of British procurement turned slowly. Too slowly. War production was a steam locomotive already at full speed. To throw new gears into the engine was to risk everything. So the Empire marched into 1944 with brilliant men on the ground, tanks in the hedgerows, ships on the Channel, but still listening to the hum of an older world. In bunkers in southern England, American paratroopers rehearsed for an invasion that would decide a continent. Behind them hummed silent radios. Ahead of them lay beaches, hedgerows, rivers, and steel. Somewhere, in an English signals office, that old British prototype, silent, clean, uncanny, rested in a storage cabinet, forgotten for a world that had moved too fast to see its promise. What the War Office once feared, America embraced, and soon, on a dawn in June, the world would learn what silence could do. Night cloaked England in June of 1944, but the men waiting in scattered marshalling fields sensed history more acutely than darkness. Crickets chirped in hedgerows, engines idled in long rows like metallic lungs, and parachutes draped shoulders like quiet promises. The world seemed to hold its breath. For months, the air had been thick with static, literal and metaphorical. Training nets buzzed with AM chatter, the hiss of ionosphere and discipline, the familiar sonic clutter of armies learning to speak across distance. But when the orders came, "Tonight," and men painted their cheeks in charcoal and dust, something unusual happened. Radios clicked over to networks that did not hiss. Silence fell. Not the anxious silence of fear, nor the stunned hush before bombardment, but the disciplined quiet of men and machines tuned to a frequency that did not waste itself. In barns and assembly sheds, paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne crouched near their gear, hands resting on the square-shouldered bodies of SCR 300 sets. Signal sergeants checked antenna whips like priests preparing relics. Officers whispered final rehearsals, water bottles filled, rifle bolts checked. In pockets lay silk maps. In the air hung the scent of canvas, coffee, and sweat. Above it all, radios waited still, patient and ready. Their British observers, liaison officers with notebooks stained by months in rain-slick English towns, watched with an emotion half awe, half unease. They had seen the demonstrations. They had heard whispers over clean circuits. They had watched a foreign doctrine settle into American bone and blood. And tonight, they would witness whether theory survived war. One captain in khaki, cap pulled low against channel mist, leaned toward a wireless operator from the 101st, a boy who looked like he belonged in a high school football kit more than in the dawn of modern warfare. "Doesn't it bother you?" the Brit asked quietly. "What's that, sir?" The silence. One never knows if the net is alive. The boy smiled faintly, tapping the side of his headset. "Oh, it's alive. You'll hear it when it needs to speak." That was the essence. AM filled the night with nervous chatter. FM waited, ready to deliver clarity without clutter. The first aircraft spun up, props carving the mist into ribbons. Then came others' Dakotas lined wingtip to wingtip, engines roaring like judgment. Inside them sat men who had practiced this moment until practice became reality. The green lights blinked on board. Static? None. Net traffic? Minimal. Only short, clipped acknowledgements. 6 actual? Check. 6-1. Good tone. 6-2. Up. Then silence again. What did silence mean? Confidence. Order. The opposite of chaos. When the jump lights glowed and boots tramped toward the doors, the radio operators moved with them, heavy sets pressing into parachute harnesses. One operator later wrote in a notebook found by his daughter decades after the war, "I carried the silence on my back. He did not mean fear, he meant clarity, purpose." Then blackness swallowed them. Wind tore at uniforms. Chalk numbers blurred into night. The channel rolled beneath like spilled ink. And as troopers drifted toward Normandy fields, hedges, swamps, and churchyards, something extraordinary happened. FM did not scream. It did not announce. It did not panic. It answered. Paratroopers scattered across countryside miles wide, in orchards and cow pastures and flooded meadows. Some landed alone, others in clusters. Some drowned under equipment in water-soaked fields. Others found French farm families who whispered blessings. And in those first terrifying minutes, when every soldier feared isolation and chaos, they touched their radios. No hiss, only potential. Captain crouched beneath an apple tree, rain drumming on leaves. He keyed his handset. Eagle to Fox check. A heartbeat then. "Fox here. We're up. 2 sticks accounted for." A short pause. Someone else. Thunder 6 men. Rally Point Hedgerow. Contact light. More voices, sparse but steady. No shouting. No confusion drowning signal. No atmospheric ghosts. Just men finding each other in darkness across a foreign land. One signal lieutenant in the 82nd would later summarize it in a debrief. "We were scattered like wheat in wind. The only thing tying us back into an army was the silence between transmissions." German listening stations along the Norman coast strained against headphones, accustomed to British chatter, the broad hiss of AM command networks, and RAF airborne circuits. Tonight they heard farmland, weather, occasional faint RAF transmissions, but no American airborne command net, no chatter, no vulnerability to intercept. German operators assumed fatally that the drop had not yet begun. Their doctrine expected noise. They equated radio silence with absence. They did not yet understand that silence could mean presence organized, coordinated, deadly. Dawn crept across hedgerows and walled churchyards. Paratroopers regrouped, bazookas emerged from bundles. Pathfinders lit beacons. Engineers set charges on causeways and bridges, and on rising channels of clean signal, battalion orders flowed like water in a clear stream, positions marked, routes confirmed. German patrol spotted near Farm Lane. One platoon sergeant keyed his set and murmured, "Take them quiet." AM might have blasted orders with static. FM whispered them with authority. Rifle bolts slid. Shadows moved. Normandy exhaled. Silence had delivered an army. Dawn was a rumour first, then a bruise of pink across the Channel fog. Naval guns still thundered offshore, shaking the sea like a great sheet of tin. Higgins' boats bucked and slapped the water, steel ramps rattling like teeth. Men huddled under helmets, each breath steaming in the cold air. The smell, cordite, diesel, salt, and fear. On paper, the plan was precise. Divisions ashore in staggered tides. Armour landing behind infantry. Naval gunfire timed to the minute. Airborne linking inland routes like steel threads tightening around a German throat. In reality, chaos. Boats drifted off course. Engineers drowned under loads. Radios soaked in salt water died in screaming sparks. Men choked in rough surf. Entire platoons lost leaders before their boots touched sand. But amid the cacophony, the world ending in artillery and machine gun tracers, a new sound cut through. Not a roar, not a whistle, a tone. Then a voice clipped, calm, unmistakably human in the mechanical fury. King 6 to King 6-2, mark strongpoint, copy, 6, splash in 30 seconds. No static, no atmospheric ghosts. No German jammers clawing into the signal. Just clean command. Silence followed, not because the radio failed, but because discipline lived there. On those beaches, silence was power. Then the world shook. A naval round screamed overhead and landed like the hammer of an angry god on a concrete bunker overlooking Omaha's dog-green sector. Men cheered but did not waste breath. The air was still thick with bullets, sand spitting like angry hornets. A ranger captain smashed his way through surf, SCR 300 manpack dragging like a stone weight on his back. His runner stumbled behind him, pack antenna whipping in the wind. They dropped next to a shingle bank, gasping. "Radio check," the captain barked. The operator keyed once. One tone. One syllable acknowledgement. Then the net fell silent again, poised, waiting. Farther up the beach, a Sherman duplex drive tank crawled through foam, its canvas screen shredded but engines stubborn as a mule. German fire bracketed it, tracers ricocheted in angry sparks. The commander ducked inside, yelled coordinates, and his gunner relayed to shore fire control through an FM net that cut through the chaos like a surgeon's blade. A British observer, attached to monitor American beach communications, ducked behind a wrecked tractor and stared in disbelief. He remembered the laughter in the lab years before, officers chuckling at quiet radios like quaint toys. Yet here, amidst death and thunder, the quiet sets were the only ones still speaking clearly. He removed his helmet, ran a hand through sand-caked hair, and muttered, "God help me." The Yanks were right. American naval spotters crouched behind beach obstacles or perched on ruined sea walls keyed their sets, speaking in tight bursts. Round walked 50 yards west. Correct 1 to 5 right. Adjust. Fire for effect. On. Splash. Move. No one argued. No one repeated unless necessary. The discipline drilled in Devon fields was now currency in blood and seconds. Every word mattered. German. Officers, accustomed to hearing Allied command nets crackle with panic, strained their headphones. They heard gunfire, they heard surf, they heard engines, but they did not hear American command nets. Confusion crept into bunkers and field posts. Reports stalled. Division HQs hesitated. The enemy's silence, not their noise, unnerved them most. One Wehrmacht signals officer near Colleville scribbled into his log, "American transmissions minimal, cannot locate primary nets," unsure of their strength or direction. He did not know he was surrounded by signals clean, sharp, invisible to his doctrine. A lieutenant, a hedge, and the sound of victory. Beyond the beaches, hedgerows waited green walls older than nations. Firefights broke in orchard rows and muddy lanes. A platoon, cut down to a handful, crouched in a ditch. Bullets cracked overhead. A machine gun nest raked the hedgerow like a saw through bone. The lieutenant wiped mud from his face and whispered to his radioman, "Get battalion, fast." The operator keyed the SCR 300. Single click. A moment later, send. Coordinates, 4 digits, a short correction. Then, silence. 30 seconds. Then the hedgerow ahead erupted, artillery landing exactly where voices had pointed. The German gun fell silent forever. The lieutenant exhaled, not in relief but in resolve. "Move," he whispered. They did. Behind them, their radio whispered nothing at all, yet commanded everything. On the beaches that morning and in the bocage that followed, silence proved deadlier than noise. Chaos still existed. Men still died by the score. Fate still rolled its cruel dice. But those with functioning FM sets spoke through the storm. They did not always win because they yelled loudest. They won because they aimed their voices like rifles. And somewhere in a lab in England, dust still clung to an early British FM prototype, the machine that could have spoken first. The set once, met with smirks and raised brows. War, ruthless teacher, had proven the truth. Battlefields belong not to the loudest, but to the clearest. Night never truly left Normandy in those first days after the landings. Smoke blotted the sun. Hedgerows trapped fog. Farmers swore the birds stayed silent because they feared the thunder of artillery the same way men did. And in that shadowed world of dirt lanes and thick walls of green, the American airborne lived a kind of hunting god existence, scattered, hungry, relentless, and guided not by trumpets or drums, but by quiet. The airborne had been built around shock. Drop suddenly, strike fast, disorient, disrupt. But shock alone means fragility. Shock scatters as easily as it conquers. The secret truth of the airborne success in Normandy was not only the rifle in the hedgerow or the knife in the dark barn, it was the voice in the ear. The FM nets, anchored by SCR 300s and SCR 500s, carried by mules, gliders, men, and sheer stubborn will, stitched chaos into cohesion. No one outside the units understood how fragile command truly was in those early hours. There were no front lines. One hedgerow could belong to America, the next to Germany, the next to neither. A barn full of hay might hide paratroopers. The next barn might hide an MG-42, and every lane smelled of wet earth, crushed leaves, cordite, and the metallic fear of ambush. Yet through the claustrophobic silence of the bocage, radiomen whispered coordinates, crossroads names, and German troop sightings into nets that did not betray them with static or noise. Able 6, contact left, platoon strength, request mortar. Range 120 yards, hedge break at the orchard, fire smoke, then silence. Then the whistle of mortar tubes. Then men moved fluid, precise, confident. Command and control in Normandy was not broad and sweeping. It was point to point, hedge to hedge, breath to breath. FM technology was not the loud general on a map. It was the sergeant crouched behind a stump, speaking 6 words, enough to shape a fight. Shift fire, left hedgerow. Now. And men obeyed not because volume compelled them, but because clarity did. German intercept units, famed for discipline and expertise, strained their headphones in orchard barns and sandbagged listening posts. In the east, they had devoured Soviet AM nets like wolves tearing open bone. In North Africa, they had read British voice behaviour like scholars. They expected war to sound like war. But in Normandy, their dial swept the spectrum and found ghosts, voices brief, nets quiet, silence that was not absence, but presence with purpose. One German signals officer later told Allied interrogators, "We knew Americans were everywhere, but the air was empty. It was like fighting shadows. Shadows do not need to shout. Shadows only need to appear at the right moment and disappear again." Historians later called it airborne trinity, not a formal doctrine, but a lived truth forged in hedgerows and farm lanes. 1. Initiative without isolation. Every squad moved like independent hunters, yet each could reach battalion in seconds when it mattered. When transmission came, it meant necessity, not confusion. 3. Precision over panic. Short orders, short bursts. No rambling, no screaming, not, "We're pinned down, help." But machine gun, orchard gate, mark, fire 2. That calm, that surgical efficiency, made young men feel like veterans long before their hair turned grey. At dawn, on June 7th, near Saint-Côme-du-Mont, a platoon of the 501st Parachute Infantry inched along a sunken lane. Dawn light slanted through oaks. Water dripped from hedges. Somewhere, a cow lowed, then fell silent, as if sensing death near. A burst of MG-42 fire ripped across the lane. Men dove, into mud and bramble. Tracers stitched bark. Someone cursed. A private bled quietly into the ditch. The lieutenant crawled forward, pressed his helmet against the earth, and keyed his handset. No shouting, no panic. This is Dog 2, 1 gun, high hedge, range 50, mark smoke. Seconds later, a mortar round hissed and burst, white plume curling into green leaves. Another burst followed, high explosive this time, tearing the hedge and silencing the gun. The lieutenant whispered, "Up and through." Men rose like ghosts. By the time they reached the shattered hedge, Germans were already withdrawing, unable to understand how artillery had arrived in 30 seconds. A sergeant spat mud and said what many thought, "They got machine guns." We got angels whispering coordinates. On June 8th, British staff officers visited American airborne positions near Sainte-Mère-Église. They saw radiomen perched calmly beneath apple trees, chewing K-rations while calling artillery, with voices barely louder than breath. One British colonel stood listening, jaw set, as a U.S. lieutenant spoke 3 words, merely 3, and watched an entire German probe dissolve under timed fire. Range, send, fire. Afterward, the colonel removed his cap, stared across the hedgerows, and admitted softly to his aide, "We thought them cowboys. It seems they are surgeons." And to his private diary that night, he wrote, "The silence is not ignorance, the silence is choice." Not every radio saved a life. Some were smashed by shrapnel. Some operators died protecting their sets like shields. A few radios failed, and in those deadly moments men faced the old nightmare of armies past, command by shouting and guessing. Yet each time silence broke with a clear order, each time artillery came like judgment, men gained faith. Faith in gear, faith in training, faith in clarity, and faith, on a battlefield, is fuel. Word spread through German ranks. American radios. Do not sleep. They bring guns without warning. If one speaks, artillery follows. Fear shifted, not of noise, but of what silence promised. The Bocage campaign would last weeks more. Blood would soak roots centuries old. Courage and exhaustion would become indistinguishable. But by then, the airborne had proven a truth that future armies would carve into doctrine. To command in battle is not to shout, it is to whisper and be obeyed. And across France, in quiet hedgerows carved by forgotten monks, soldiers learned that the most dangerous army is not the loudest. It is the one whose silence means certainty. The Bocage did not care who owned it. It swallowed sound, swallowed bullets, swallowed men. It was a labyrinth carved by centuries of farmers and priests, and armies were only the newest trespassers. In that living maze, the British Army learned reluctantly at first, then with hungry urgency, that the future spoke differently than tradition. For years, before Normandy, the British Army had trained its ears to hear war. Voice nets filled the desert air in North Africa, command nets buzzing across the stony ground between Matilda tanks and Bren carriers. Theirs was a war of voices, of officers barking orders across sand-hot static, command by volume, by discipline, by the stiff spine of doctrine. but Normandy silenced them. In the days after the landings, British brigadiers and colonels walked American sectors not out of curiosity, but necessity. Their own networks, brave, experienced, battle-tested in multiple theatres, were suffering the cruel math of bocage warfare. Too much noise meant too little certainty. A single hedgerow could hide an entire platoon or leave a company blind and believing ghosts. So they came, notebooks in hand, observing American airborne and infantry battalions that seemed to whisper armies into existence. One staff colonel, a veteran of El Alamein, the Western Desert, and Sicily, stood beside a U.S. artillery forward observer near Carentan and listened to a fire mission. A German machine gun nest had pinned down an American rifle squad. No shouting, no wild radio chatter. Just this. Able 6, target hedge break, right of orchard. Pause. Fire when ready. Seconds later, the earth flamed and shook. Leaves soared. Silence returned. The colonel looked at his aide and said, quietly and with no trace of sarcasm, "This is not wireless as we know it. It is mathematics spoken through earth and blood." He had commanded regiments by map and voice and tradition. Now he watched young American lieutenants command by precision, not projection. British signals officers returned to headquarters meetings in Bayeux and Portsmouth with unusual language in their reports. American FM tactical radios exhibit remarkable clarity. Paratroop nets demonstrate superior noise immunity. Recommend immediate study and phased adoption. There was, at first, bureaucratic resistance. Pride is a uniform no soldier likes to remove. A few generals still clung to early war assumptions. American equipment was always heavy. American doctrine was always brute force. British ingenuity and subtlety would prevail, but in Normandy's hedgerows, subtlety only killed men. So the shift began quietly, not a coup, not an admission of error, but a pragmatic evolution. British signals detachments shadowed American units, copied net discipline, and requested trial sets. Royal engineers scribbled notes on modulation, frequency allocation, and suppression of ignition noise. Workshops experimented, modifying existing sets where possible, requisitioning Allied stock when needed. It was not overnight. Doctrine never changes overnight. But every day, British radio silence grew more intentional. A handful of British officers became evangelists not for American technology, but for American philosophy of communication. Major John Whitmore, Royal Corps of Signals, wrote in a field memo later archived at Whitehall, "War belongs to the army that hears itself clearest and betrays itself the least." He did not praise the SCR 300's engineering. He praised the discipline of silence it imposed. Colonel Edward Rawlins, then commanding signals support to armoured formations, observed, "We must cease treating wireless as a pipe to be filled. It is a blade sharpened when silent, fatal when used correctly." These were not fringe men. They were planners, thinkers, and most critically survivors of North Africa's radio-dominated desert campaigns. When war teaches, wise men listen, and Normandy was teaching with artillery and graves. Meanwhile, German signal intelligence officers wrestled with a terrible truth. They could no longer read their enemy through the air. They were used to intercepted fragments, snippets of panic, half-shouted orders, disjointed nets. In Normandy they heard something worse than enemy voices. They heard almost nothing. To a German operator at a dug-in listening post near Tilly-sur-Seulles, American radio traffic sounded like no war at all. And so German counterattacks arrived into coordinated fields of fire. Mortars answered faster than expected. Allied counter-batteries reacted in seconds, not minutes. A captured German signals NCO later said, "Against the Russians, we heard everything. Against the British, we heard enough. Against the Americans, we heard death." By July, British units began blending systems. Existing HF and AM sets for long-range command, experimental VHF, and FM sets for company-level nets, shared signal plans with U.S. Corps and airborne divisions. Adoption of American brevity and net discipline. suppression of unnecessary transmission, local radio silence drills, refined in real combat. Communication became less about presence and more about impact. One British battalion commander remarked, "A net should be a scalpel, not a trumpet." There was no humiliation in this shift, only the quiet professionalism that armies earn in blood. Near Caen, a British armoured squadron advanced through narrow lanes. German 88s lurked beyond hedges like coiled serpents. Before, a tank commander would have barked orders over AM chatter. Now he leaned into his FM handset, borrowed from a U.S. liaison detachment, and spoke 8 words. Panther right, smoke, 2, hull down, advance, slow. No static, no second transmission. The column moved like a fist. Later he said, "It felt like pulling a silk thread through steel." That is what FM had become, not a gadget, not American eccentricity, but a force multiplier made of restraint. The bocage would fall hedge by hedge, villages would burn, men would die in rows beneath apple trees and along stone walls older than gunpowder, but the transition had begun. British engineers sketched blueprints for post-war sets influenced by American modulation. Staff colleges, quietly, revised manuals. Future doctrine took shape in barns and foxholes, not Whitehall. No band played, no headline shouted the news. But in France, officers saw the truth. The modern army was the army that listened least and heard most. Silence was no longer uncertainty. Silence was readiness. And the battlefield would never sound the same. Edwin Howard Armstrong never designed radios for applause. He designed them for truth in the air signal, without deceit, command without static, communication without chaos. But for far too long, the world, and particularly the great armies that marched through it, mistook clarity for luxury. In the 1920s, Armstrong stood in his Columbia University lab with wires coiled like ivy across benches and glass tubes glowing like captured ember. He had already gifted the world the regenerative circuit and the superheterodyne milestones that bent wireless transmission toward precision. But the inventor bore another vision, frequency, not amplitude, as the carrier of human voice through space. Where M rode the weather and whim, FM carved its message into air like a blade. He demonstrated it to generals and executives alike. Calm, precise, no theatrics, only reality. And when his FM prototype hummed alive, the speakers did not crackle with distance, or spit thunder from passing cars, or flicker with lightning on distant planes. They were quiet, and then true. No static, no hiss, just a voice, sharper and cleaner than any signal of its age. One colonel whispered to another, "It sounds unnatural. A wireless should sound like war." Perhaps the greatest curse of genius is to deliver the future to men who prefer the past. Armstrong approached the British first, as polite and formal as his 3-piece suit. The Air Ministry tested his system in quiet rooms and damp fields. Engineers nodded in grudging awe as rainstorms failed to twist FM's tone, as ignition noise on military lorries faded into nothing, as enemy interference that crippled AM nets simply washed past. The test reports were glowing, the conclusions were fatal, too new, too disruptive to existing doctrine, too complex to retool factories under wartime emergency, interoperability concerns with Commonwealth allies. There, on onion paper stamped in Admiralty ink, Armstrong's dream was delayed by tradition. The British refused, not out of ignorance but of caution. War rewards efficiency, not revolution. Armstrong left London with a polite handshake and a thin smile that could not hide the disappointment tightening behind his eyes. He carried his blueprints west. And across the Atlantic, in the vast industrial maw of the United States, destiny waited. The U.S. Signal Corps did not see curiosity in Armstrong's FM proposal. They saw advantage tactical, material, technological. They saw clear command in artillery barrages, noise immunity in tank columns, precision in air-ground coordination, security through discipline, not encryption. And most importantly, they saw manufacture at speed. Factories danced with new possibilities. RCA balked bitter from patent disputes, but Motorola, Galvin Manufacturing, and other firms moved fast. The SCR 300 Infantry FM set was born. The SCR 508 armored radio followed. FM did not request permission. It arrived with steel cases and vacuum tubes and operational doctrine. Armstrong was invited to review early production sets. A young lieutenant asked him, "Sir, do you think this will really change combat?" He replied with a quiet certainty only a man who has seen the future can muster. When officers speak without fear of static, they will command without hesitation. Normandy would be Armstrong's courtroom, the bocage his witness stand, FM its own defense. American paratroopers whispered commands across darkness on D-Day. Tanks advanced without broadcasting panic across hedgerows. Artillery batteries corrected fire with the calm of accountants. Armstrong's invention did not kill. It allowed those who fought to decide who lived. By summer of 1944, British brigadiers who once trusted only hiss and discipline watched Americans call fire missions like surgeons whispering in an operating theatre. They did not praise the radios first. They praised the certainty. A Royal Navy observer, watching U.S. destroyers coordinate fire support for British commandos near Sword Beach, wrote in his after-action notes, "Their air is clean, our air crackles with fear." This was not technical language. It was truth in uniform. Yet Armstrong's personal battlefield remained corporate and bitter. RCA, once his ally, fought him in courtrooms, not foxholes. Armored with lawyers instead of steel, they claimed FM infringed their patents, that his work was derivative. It was war by memos, not rifles. And though soldiers placed faith in FM, the post-war civilian world was slower to follow. Armstrong's finances bled. The inventor who gave modern armies the ability to speak across hell found himself shouting alone into the legal wind. His dream survived in hedgerows and foxholes and airborne drops, but the man who birthed it carried scars unseen by history books. In January 1954, exhausted and cornered by litigation, Armstrong stepped from the 13th floor of the River House in Manhattan. There was no battlefield courage in his hands, as he felt only despair that the world he improved had no mercy to spare. Yet death did not defeat him. FM was already marching across the post-war world. In radios, in civilian broadcasting, in police and aviation networks, in NATO doctrine, in tank platoons preparing for Cold War battlefields as deadly and silent as Normandy's lanes. Armstrong had not been rejected by history, only delayed by it. In 1985, at a joint U.S. British Signals Symposium in Aldershot, a retired British brigadier stood to address younger officers. He had commanded radios before Normandy and after it. When he spoke of that change, he did not speak of circuits. He spoke of confidence. When you key a microphone and know you will be heard, not distorted, not drowned, not betrayed by noise, you command differently. You command with certainty. The room was silent, not with reverence but recognition. He ended with a sentence that could have been carved in bronze. Armstrong did not give us radios. He gave us trust. Armstrong will never be carved in stone beside generals. He wore no medals in combat. Yet every whisper across storm-filled skies, every calm order given under fire, every life saved by clarity rather than noise is his monument. Armstrong's revenge was not victory over RCA. It was victory over chaos. War is not won by shouting. It is won by those who can speak clearly in fear and be heard. And on the hedgerows of Normandy, in the skies, over the Pacific, across every battlefield where silence demanded attention, Armstrong's voice lived in the radios of men who survived because of it. He did not live to see his vindication, but history salutes him, still not with trumpets, but with the quiet hum of circuits and the clean whisper of command across the air. For in war, as in invention, silence is not absence, it is supremacy. The bocage country of Normandy in summer looked, from the air, like a peaceful quilt, hedgerows stitched into the earth for centuries, every lane a green tunnel, every farm a fortress. But to those who fought there, the bocage was not beauty, it was a maze of death. Sound travelled strangely. A rifle crack vanished behind a wall of leaves. A tank engine echoed like ghosts in corridors of living earth. Sight lines ended after 20 paces. Armies felt blind, commanders deaf. In such country, communication was the battlefield. Static could kill. Hesitation could doom a platoon. An order lost in crackle could mean a column stalled in an ambush line. The Germans, veterans of defensive warfare, believed they would feast in that maze. Their field telephones ran through buried cable, and short-range AM radios hissed through the hedgerows. But they had not known Armstrong's silence. American infantry did. And, in the green hells of Normandy, silence became a weapon. June 9th, 1944, Saint-Côme-du-Mont. Lieutenant James Ambrose, 101st Airborne, pressed the handset of his SCR-300, the man-portable FM set weighing 35 pounds. He whispered, "Fox Company, advance one hedgerow. No thunder, no static roar. No voice warped by engine magnetos or lightning crackle atmospherics. Just calm, low, and certain carried by a frequency band Britain had once considered theoretical luxury. Fox Company moved. German machine guns opened. American mortars replied almost instantly, their forward observers hearing Ambrose's correction not through garbled shouts, but clear FM syllables. Captain Taro Suzuki of the Japanese 4th Air Group, years later reviewing captured Normandy radio logs at a post-war symposium, marveled at the precision. They sounded as if they were speaking in the next room. Quiet voices commanding storms. He had never fought in France, but he recognized the meaning. American radios did not broadcast fear. They broadcast intention. Tanks in hedgerows had once been clumsy beasts, noses buried in green walls, flanks exposed, radios screaming with electrical hash. The Germans expected such clumsiness. They planned on it. Then the Sherman crews arrived with SCR-508s, humming in tranquil VHF clarity. No ignition buzz, no squeal, no interference from field generators or nearby vehicles. A platoon leader could speak softly. Button up, push. Angle left, 2 degrees. High explosive, hedge breach. And Steele obeyed instantly. In one engagement near Carrington, a panzer, commander later said in interrogation, "We heard nothing until we saw the movement. American tanks moved like they had one mind. They did. A radio net, unpolluted by atmosphere, made them so. To the unaware, a tank platoon is brute force. To those who command them, coordination is everything. Where AM gave orders like thunder over a storming sea, FM delivered them like notes on staff paper, precise, timed, harmonized. War is often described as noise, but victory is orchestration. And now the Allies had a conductor's baton. After the war, in dusty Paris archives, a report written by the British Royal Signals Corps in autumn 1944 revealed their grudging awe. The Americans have achieved wireless discipline not through discipline at all, but through technology. WhisperNet communication changes battlefield psychology. Engineers, not infantry, coined the phrase that historians would later adopt, the hedgehog network. Every platoon a spike, every places, company another. All covered in overlapping communication rings, impossible to drown, hard to detect, immune to the atmospheric noise that chewed German nets into panic. It was not glamour. It was not heroism. It was infrastructure as weapon. In the age of mass warfare, nothing mattered more. German doctrine leaned on wire. Signals teams buried cable. Runners carried corrections. Radios were backup, not backbone. But in the hedgerows, cable teams died under mortars. Lines snapped under tank treads. Runners bled into the earth. A corporal from Panzerlehr wrote in his private journal captured near Saint-Lô, "We are blind in the hedges. The Americans speak to each other like gods in the leaves." Meanwhile, American battalion headquarters could speak to companies without yelling, without delay. An artillery observer in a church steeple could pass fire adjustments as calmly as if sitting in a classroom. no frantic shouting through crackle. No, say again, repeated until hope faded. No wasted seconds. Seconds, the most expensive currency in close combat. To fight a modern war is not simply to move troops, it is to manage fear, confusion, adrenaline, and uncertainty, chemical storms inside every man. Bad radios magnify that storm, good radios calm it. Paratrooper diaries tell the truth plainly. When the net was quiet, we were steady. We knew higher command hadn't vanished. I never felt alone. Compare to German entries. Every man fights in his own soundscape of terror. Radios scream, lines are cut, we guess at orders. The enemy moves fast. We move in doubt. The Germans could not understand how American units pivoted so quickly after contact. They saw cunning. They saw coordination beyond human reflex. They didn't see the quiet handset in a hedgerow FM, whispering confidence while AM shouted confusion. By late July, as Operation Cobra broke the bocage and Allied armour surged into open country, British commanders had made their decision. They ordered mass conversion to FM tactical sets for post-invasion operations. Too late to lead the innovation, just in time to benefit from it. A British signals colonel, watching American tankers coordinating across fields like a murmuration of steel, murmured the only eulogy AM deserved. We did not lose the radio war. We never realized there was one. Combat is noise, fear is noise, uncertainty is noise. FM did not simply carry sound, it carved quiet into the battlefield. That quiet let men think, decide, act, live. When historians write of Normandy, they speak of courage, of steel, of sacrifice. Rarely do they speak of the invisible lattice of sound that held units together like nerves in a living body. Yet those who fought knew. They heard victory before they saw it, a whisper through the hedgerows, advance. And the war obeyed.